morning, everyone. Thank you for getting out bright and early, especially those of you who are West Coast residents. And for this early morning session, which is entitled Race, Community, and Governance in the French Antilles Before 1789. I am Michael Breen, Professor of History and Humanities at College in Portland, Oregon, and I will be chairing today's session and also giving a sort of brief comment at the end. I want to say it's a real pleasure for me to be part of this session, both because I know and respect the work of all three of the presenters today, Matt Gerber, who I've known for a long time, and then Michael Beauvreau and Nancy Christie, who I've gotten to know in the last couple of years. And actually the first time I'm meeting them in person, even though we've had some chats over Zoom during the pandemic, as we're all familiar with. So what I'll do is I'm going to introduce, because the session is being recorded, I will introduce each speaker individually and have them come up. And so we're going to start with Professor Matthew Gerber. Professor Gerber is Associate Professor of History at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He did his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. He is perhaps best known as the author of a book which has one of the best titles, I think, that's any book that I've ever read, Bastards. The subtitle of which is Politics, Family, and Law. 18th century France, early modern France, which came out from Oxford in 2012. Matt has also published a number of articles and particularly more recently on kind of issues of race and law in the French Caribbean. There was an article a number of years ago looking at French historical studies, if I recall correctly, and a much more recent article on Angélique José, mother of Vincent Auger, which came out in the Histoire moderne et contemporaine. Matt is also, all three of our speakers today are also co-editors of this volume, which I highly, highly recommend. Voices in the Legal Archives in the French Colonial World, The King is Listening. It's a really kind of a good introduction to much of the recent scholarship in the field of sort of early modern French colonial history, papers by Suki Bach and others, for instance, in there. And today, Matt will be talking about 3 murders in the Artibonite, violence, generation, and racialization in early 18th century French Saint-Domingue. So please join me in welcoming Matt Gerber.
Great, thank you, Michael. Also, I want to start by apologizing to my editor at Oxford University Press for leaving off the Oxford comma in the title. Thank you all for coming out for this early morning session on race, community, and governance in the French Antilles for 1789. This panel seeks to explore intersections between early modern colonial communities and broader systems of French imperial governance, in order to elucidate complexities within broader histories of race, or as I prefer to call it, racialization. While I have scrupulously tried to avoid stigmatic language in my own authorial truth claims, I should warn everyone that I will be citing 18th century sources whose terminology is today objectionable. My paper seeks to understand 3 homicides that took place in the Artibonite Valley in the western province of French colonial Saint-Domingue, within an 18-month period stretching from 1741 to 1743. These murders not only occurred within a limited time frame, they also happened within 1 or 2 miles of one another in an area known as the Savant Brûlé, located about 6 miles north of the burg of Petite Rivière de l'Artibonite. Their peculiar density becomes even clearer if one plots them on the geographer Philippeau's magisterial 1790 map of the Artibonite. It's really an amazing map. It has property lines, etc., which are quite helpful. Here I've indicated the murder locations with red dots. Zooming in, we can pinpoint where it was that on the morning of 14th November 1741, a French colonist named Jean Hervé, better known as Camille, confronted his neighbor Jacques Marchand over the latter's retention of an enslaved woman belonging to him. Tempers flared, shots were fired, and within a week, Marchand lay dead from a chest wound. 16 months later, not far from the same spot, a colonist named Nicolas Sterlin shot and killed his neighbor, Antoine Trivier, in revenge for a whiplash Trivier had given him across the face after Sterlin had insulted Trivier's wife. 2 months after that, within 2 miles of the same spot, Pierre Raymond killed a plantation manager by the name of Marcoul over his mistreatment of enslaved individuals. I'm unaware of any other set of homicides from the early modern French colonial world that is as chronologically and geographically dense as this one. Were these murders somehow related? Historians have long found murders to be useful sites for scholarly investigation. Because homicides transgress communal norms, they tend to throw those norms into sharper relief. Murders have consequently been at the heart of pioneering micro-studies of early modern France by scholars such as Natalie Z. Davis, Jeffrey S. Ravel, James R. Farr, and Sarah Beam, all of whom have used criminal cases to illuminate social and cultural systems that might otherwise have remained obscure. For historians of the early modern French Caribbean, one challenge in creating similar microhistories has been that virtually no judicial records survive in original form from the region from any time before the 7 Years' War. Partial copies of some such records can be found within the archives of the French Naval Ministry, including the fragmentary trial transcripts for the 3 murders I have just mentioned. However, exclusive reliance on such copies potentially reproduces selection bias, luring scholars into tendentious conclusions. Even significant ancillary sources such as material records or probate inventories are often lacking. How then can historians reconstruct local contexts sufficiently to allow for convincing interpretations of colonial homicides to be advanced? In my analysis of these 3 murders, I want to argue that local context can be reconstructed using parish registers of baptisms, burials, and deaths, though the work is, quite frankly, painstaking. Demographic historians have long used such records to trace patterns of fertility and mortality, but registers from the 18th century French Caribbean are less useful for this, given that most spiritual acts involving enslaved individuals, if recorded at all, were kept separately. Read, however, as multi-authored cultural artifacts, rather than as transparent windows into human comportment, the registers nevertheless illuminate a great deal about colonial society in the early 18th century Artibonite. They reveal, for example, that natural, affable, legal, and spiritual forms of kinship were all crucial to the creation of vertical and horizontal networks of communal support. Central nodes of these networks were often Creole women and wives, some but not all of whom had enslaved ancestors. Officials of church and state complained about the spiritual indifference of colonial parents who failed to baptize their offspring within a month of birth as required by canon law. But the real cause for the delay was the need for colonial families to arrange godparents who could establish substantial, if informal and extra-legal bonds of obligation, particularly among individuals who were not related by blood. Godparents who at first glance in the parish registers appear to have been complete strangers often turn out, upon closer examination, to have been grandparents, uncles, aunts, or cousins, whether through affinity or nature. Reciprocal acts of godparenting sometimes help to consolidate alliances established between male immigrants through marriages to Creole sisters. Marriages between first and second cousins were commonplace, further complicating the mix, as were numerous remarriages. One is occasionally left with the impression that a majority of property-owning colonists in the Artibonite were entailed in some form of natural, spiritual, or affable incest. When analyzed in conjunction with the Philippot map, the parish registers also suggest that initial French settlement of the Artibonite was a collective rather than individualistic enterprise. It was spearheaded above all by a handful of elite refugees who had fled Saint Christophe and Saint Croix during the late wars of Louis XIV, and they brought with them entourages of clients who settled on lands carved out from large concessions granted to military officers and the wealthiest planters. physical proximity did not create spiritual, legal, and national ties. Rather, natural and national kinship created physical proximity as people settled close to families and allies. Such local contexts were rapidly erased anytime trial transcripts were sent across the ocean to Versailles for review. If the 3 murder cases at hand are known to us at all, it is only because they produced appeals for royal clemency and pardon, which in turn required partial and selected copies of investigations to be drawn up. In colonial cases, appeals for royal pardon passed through the naval ministry on their way to the king, and the minister often turned to colonial administrators for advice. Even colonial prosecutors, however, appear to have been less concerned with who committed murders, or for that matter why, than with how, that is, under what circumstances. That is because royal remissions were readily granted for involuntary manslaughters, acts of self-defense, and even many crimes of passion, but premeditated murders were typically viewed as unpardonable. This was particularly the case with homicides stemming from dueling. Indeed, when information about Sterland's murder of Tribier reached all the way up to Louis XV in 1746, the king not only complained to the naval minister that murders were, quote, more frequent in Saint-Domingue than elsewhere, unquote, he also blamed this on an inexcusable laxity on the part of judges, citing their failure to investigate sufficiently whether colonial homicides were not, in fact, the result of duels. Because of this important distinction, royal prosecutors investigated motives and circumstances only to the extent that they might help establish whether a duel had taken place. Meanwhile, the allies of victims and killers alike, many of whom might be deposed as witnesses, ironically had a common interest in avoiding conviction for dueling because this would entail not only confiscation of property, but also exclusion of the perpetrator's kin from holding public offices due to their stigmatic association with a capital offense. The Sterland case is known only because his family made a second appeal for clemency some 40 years after his crime, by which time he himself was dead. An additional challenge for historians is that when colonial administrators and ministry clerks forwarded conclusive summaries of cases to their superiors, local details were often elided for the sake of expediency. In the case of Tammy's murder of Jacques Marchand, for example, the colonial governor and intendant reduced their murderous conflict to an impassioned scuffle between, and I quote, a bad subject who was highly quarrelsome, namely Marchand, and a merry breadwinner who had always comported himself well, namely Tammy. In the process, they elided that the violent confrontation originated from a bitter dispute over Marchand's retention of enslaved women belonging to Tammy. Summarizing the same dossier for the minister, one naval clerk reduced 5 individually named witnesses mentioned in the trial transcript to their respective social positions as, and I quote, a Creole black slave of Tammy, a proprietor, the wife of a proprietor, a 15-year-old Boulatresse libre, and an 18-year-old Negre serving Marchand. The naval minister, after all, knew nothing of these people in question, namely Francois, Jacques Couture, Marie-Catherine Blancheton, Magdalene Batard, and La Rose, to give them their names. He merely wanted to know whether a duel had taken place. To limit historical accounts of such cases to the surviving dossiers in the Naval Ministry archives is thus to risk falling into a kind of administrative myopia induced by epistemological streamlining that was designed to serve royal needs and agendas with little regard for local circumstances and interests. To illustrate the interpretive value of communal context, I want to summarize each of the 3 murders as they emerge from the ministerial records, then reconsider them in light of information drawn from parish registers. While each murder had its own unique origin, their chronological and geographical proximity suggests increased communal tensions within the Artibonite due to a conjuncture among generational turnover, new immigration, economic downturn associated with the War of Austrian Succession, and growing anxiety and debate over sexuality, enslavement, ancestral origins, and the significance of Creole women to vertical and horizontal networks of colonial production, reproduction, and sociability. According to a criminal complaint lodged by Jacques Marchand's brother, Pierre, 3 days after his death, Jacques had been killed by Jean Tammy on the edge of the Blancheton estate while returning home to the habitation he was leasing from Marie Dufresne, seen on the upper left, after having picked up a horse from a habitation of Sieur la Ville seen at the lower center. There were no eyewitnesses to the murder. Although Pierre alleged that Tommy had fired both shots heard that morning in the neighborhood, 3 of the 5 witnesses mentioned earlier offered details that contradicted Pierre's account. Jacques Couture, a neighbor whom Jacques had summoned after seeking aid in the nearby home of Sieur Cagnier, noted that Marchand had boasted about seizing one of Tommy's pistols during their scuffle. And yet both Marie-Catherine Blancheton, Penday's wife, and Magdalene Battard, the 15-year-old La Fesse Libre who lived with the couple, noted that the gun in question had not been fired. Tommy's enslaved commandeur, Francois, claimed that his master told him that Marchand had shot at him first, after which he had been forced to defend himself, wounding him. Both Blancheton and Couture noted that Marchand had refused to disclose the reason for his conflict with Tommy, even though they had separately asked him about it. They hinted at contempt toward themselves on the part of Marchand. Couture also quoted Marchand as saying he was, quote, angry that he had not killed Tommy, all the more so given that if he had, he, Jacques Marchand, would have easily obtained a pardon. In the end, it was Tommy who obtained the pardon because Marchand was dead. The colonial administrator seemingly concluded that Tommy had been acting in self-defense. The parish registers nuanced such a straightforward reading, first by revealing the source of Jacques Marchand's confidence, contempt, and pride. He was the younger brother of Louis Marchand and the affluent brother-in-law of Pierre de la Ville, 2 of the richest men in the Artibonite Valley. Their sugar plantations, which are actually rare in the Artibonite, are seen here marked in green, west of the Sauvage Brûlé. Natives of La Rochelle, Louis Marchand and La Ville had forged an alliance with one another through their marriages to Françoise and Marie Germaine, Creole sisters of fully European descent. They in turn formed spiritual bonds with many of the valley's elite families from Saint-Croix and Saint-Christophe, such as Charles Neveu, the local militia commander, and members of the ubiquitous Rossignol clan. Jacques Marchand consequently believed he had powerful allies. However, Jacques Marchand was unmarried, and he was merely leasing a corral inherited and still owned by a 9-year-old Boulder named Marie Dufresne. Dufresne's godfather and likely guardian was Jacques Couture, the second witness. Born in an obscure Norman village, Couture had married to a Creole named Elizabeth de l'Est, the daughter of a Mulâtresse from Veracruz named Dominique Lacoste, who may have been seized in a 1683 freebooter raid. Elizabeth de l'Est's brother Claude was the second husband of Anne Lebin, herself a Mulâtresse from Saint-Christophe, who was the mother of Marie-Catherine Blancheton, the third witness. While Jacques Marchand had powerful family connections elsewhere in the valley, he lived in a neighborhood where he lay outside a tight-knit group bound together through marriages and reciprocal acts of godparenting, some of whose ancestors had been enslaved. Tommy belonged to this network too, and he had his own sources of protection through his wife, Marie-Louise Descasseaux. Along with her brother Louis, she was the natural offspring of Louis Descasseaux, a Creole military officer from Martinique, and a freeborn negress named Françoise, who seemingly belonged to the Blancheton de l'Est entourage. The properties of the latter, including that of Rondeau, adjoined the Descasseaux habitation, suggesting all were carved in common out of a larger concession granted to Descasseaux's maternal grandfather, Pierre Pesset, a commandant of the Artibonite back in 1713. Descasseaux stayed in contact with his natural offspring even after his 1720 marriage to Elizabeth Bertrand Lapointe, a Creole from Saint-Christophe, who actually serves as godmother to one of her husband's natural grandchildren. And Tommy's connections with Descasseaux help explain why colonial administrators gave him a sympathetic ear, leading to his pardon. Marie-Louise Descasseaux, Tommy's wife, was barely mentioned during the investigation into Jacques Marchand's death, yet she played an instrumental role as a witness to events surrounding Nicolas Sterlin's murder of Antoine Trivier 16 months later. In her deposition, she recounted how on the night of 15 September 1742, her enslaved commandeur François had been returning from an errand to the home of Madame Descasseaux, that is, the wife of her natural father. Seen toward the bottom of this image, when he encountered an armed Nicolas Sterlin lying in wait for Trivier in front of the habitation belonging to the heirs of Jean Foucault, including Foucault's widow, a mulâtresse named Catherine Boissier. Having heard rumors of a quarrel between Trivier and Sterlin earlier that day, Marie-Louise Descasseaux sent a warning to Boissier's French-born son-in-law, Sieur Guyot, thinking Trivier might be visiting him. 4 months later, Sterlin shot and killed Trivier in front of Guyot's habitation. The ensuing investigation was longer and more complicated than the Marchand case, entailing 25 witnesses, but prosecutors ultimately concluded that a duel had taken place because Sterlin had insulted Trivier's wife. But how and why? One witness referred simply to, quote, Nicolas Sterlin having said some revolting words to Trivier on the main road, unquote. While another added, quote, Nicolas Sterlin had said such a grossly stupid thing to Trivier that he felt obliged to demand justice from him, unquote. Defending Trivier's memory, which was also put on trial for dueling, a mulâtre named Claude Rossignol said under interrogation that the fight had been, quote, for a supposed insult that the said Nicolas Sterlin had made to the said Trivier on account of the wife of the said Trivier. Based on the trial record alone, Sterlin's motivations for the insult remain obscure. Parish registers reveal that Nicolas Sterlin was the Creole son of a French-born surgeon, Jean Sterlin, who in 1709 had married a Creole woman of European parents named Marguerite Desforges. Marguerite's sister, Marie, married another surgeon named Louis Grouet, creating a long-standing bond between the Sterlin and Grouet clans. By 1742, Grouet's sole heir, Marie-Louise Grouet, had married a naval treasurer named Gabriel Michel Magnan, a native of Constantinople. The couple leased land to Antoine Trivier. Nicolas Sterlin lived next door to his cousin Grouet, leasing land from his own mother and his stepfather, François-André de Silly. One of 8 surviving children of the surgeon, his prospects were unclear given the preference of Creole families to marry their daughters to either French immigrants or to well-connected military or judicial officers. Trivier, by contrast, had been born in France and was the son of a rural notary. He had married Benine Desplantes, a Creole whose mother, Marie Langevin, had been described as a mulâtresse at her burial. Like Jacques Marchand, Sterlin found himself surrounded by socially modest French immigrants who had been willing to marry Creole women with enslaved ancestors, even if he and his brothers all remained single. It seems likely that out of jealousy, Sterlin had questioned the sexual honor of Trivier's wife, especially as she had given birth to her 3rd child just a few months earlier. The 3rd and final murder, committed by Pierre Remondière in self-defense against an econom named Marcol, was directly witnessed only by 5 enslaved individuals, all African-born. Their testimony is interesting in demonstrating awareness that Marcol was merely managing land inherited by Remondière's half-nephews. The witnesses confirmed that the day before, Remondière had sent some of his own enslaved individuals to gather food from the habitation, as was his right by inheritance. Marcol had chased them off with blows, breaking the arm of one of them. When Remondière confronted him, Marcol attacked him with a baton, prompting Remondière to draw his sword and stab him. A pardon was readily granted. While the trial transcript hinted at growing tensions over food amid an economic downturn wrought by the War of Austrian Succession, it also featured conflict between free men over their respective authority over enslaved individuals, something that also factored into Marchand's conflict with Trivier. Here, the parish register only adds that while Marcol was a French immigrant who seemingly knew no one, Remondière was a Creole whose mother was a native of Saint-Christophe. Curiously, all 3 homicides involved Creoles killing French immigrants, albeit for different reasons. While each murder presented its own unique story, collectively they suggest growing communal tension created by generational turnover and increasing in-migration. Because Creole women, whether descendants of enslaved ancestors or not, were crucial in holding together vertical and horizontal networks of communal support, their sexuality and marriage choices became murderous flashpoints for conflict between rival male colonists. Decades later, the persistence of these conflicts would prompt Vincent Auger to rebel against colonial authorities on behalf of, quote, free people of color, quote. Curiously, Auger's natural half-aunt was Marie-Louise Descasseaux. Thank you.